Am I live? Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our inaugural public webinar, The Trend. Today's topic is going to be the very weighted US election 2020. I'm Steve Lim, the Chief Learning Officer of Affin Hwang Asset Management, and I'll be your host and the moderator for the discussion later. We are merely about 10 days away from the US presidential election. It would not be an overstatement to say this is probably one of the most important and hotly contested US election in the last 30 to 50 years. What's on the ticket is not merely Democrats versus Republicans, but decency versus impropriety, liberalism versus conservatism, globalization versus nationalism, and inclusion versus division. As a revered American academic, Noam Chomsky says, if unchecked, one of the candidates, you may be able to guess who, could potentially start the next World War pressing the wrong button. A lot is at stake here. Okay, before we start, let's warm up with a poll. Today's topic, one of the major topic is going to be poll. Let's do a poll. Who do you think will win the US election? Okay, just choose one. There is only two. Only those who registered will be able to participate in this poll. If you're on FB Live, unfortunately you can't. Okay. While you're choosing the answer, let me just go through some housekeeping matters. To improve the internet connection, we recommend closing access windows on your PC. There is also a Q&A session at the end of today's forum. Please feel free to type your questions and submit them via Zoom's Q&A box. You can also click like to upvote questions to the top. Lastly, I'd like to make a disclaimer to all our guests today. Please note that today's forum and all related content is for discussion purpose only. Nothing from this forum is intended to be or shall be construed as an offer to buy or sell or an invitation to subscribe to any securities or investment. Please do your own research and speak to a qualified investment professional before making any decision to invest. Okay, next, allow me to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers today. Dr. Adrian Ang. Dr. Ang is a research fellow in the US program at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, short form RSIS, in Nanyang Technology University, Singapore. He holds a doctorate of philosophy in political science from the University of Missouri in Columbia, and also a Master of Arts in International Relations from University of Calgary, Canada. Prior to joining RSIS, he was an assistant professor at the Florida International University, and also worked in the private sector as a research consultant. His research interests include American public opinion, political parties, elections, campaigns, and voting behavior, and congressional politics. Now you know why we invited Dr. Ang today. This is his core competence. The next panelist is Mark Odile. Odell. Mark is an American citizen living in Asia for the last 26 years. He first came to Malaysia in 2000 and is currently a PR. Retired in 2018. His last role was Group CEO of Manulife Holding Berhad. Now he's the CEO of Life Insurance Association of Malaysia, also known as LIAM. Okay. Mark is joining us today in his own personal capacity, and he's a keen political observer of US politics. The third panelist, Mr. Lim Chia-Wei, is a portfolio manager senior portfolio manager of Affin Hwang Asset Management. He's the portfolio manager for Asia ex-Japan equity funds. His stock and macro research coverage includes Korea and US. Prior to joining Huffin Huang Asset Management in June 2015. He was the assistant manager in Public Mutual, where he covered China stocks and Asia Telecom stocks. Chow Wei graduated with the bachelor's in computer, majoring in software engineering from Staffordshire University, UK. He's also a chartered financial analyst charter holder, CFA. Lastly, but not least, Ernest Kopp. Ernest is currently the associate in Huffin Huang Asset Management's Learning Academy. He joined us in late 2019, a recent graduate from University of Warwick, where he was a training officer of his University Model United Nations team. Ernest takes large interest in global politics, in particular, the politics of UN, UK, and US. He may be young, I can assure you, he knows a lot about the US politics. Okay, we ready for the result of the first poll? All right, who do you think will win the election? Okay, Biden 55%, Trump 45%. Okay, this is just what you think, who you think is going to win the election. How about the second results? Who do you wish to win the election? Okay, looks like there are a lot more Democrats than Republicans here. A lot more sane people than the, you know what I mean? Okay. Okay, we are taking these first two polls. You see the result now. Okay, we're going to take another poll at the end of the session, just to gauge after whether this discussion on US politics, okay, is going to sway your opinion as to who is going to win the election. Okay. Okay, we're going to start the presentation by Ernest. Ernest is going to go through some basics about US politics, the Electoral College system, some so-called national level factors that's going to influence the election result. Okay, can I pass over to you, Ernest?
Yes, you may. Okay, thank you very much, Steve, for giving me the time to speak today. It is really an honor to speak to all of you about the American election. As Steve mentioned, we'll be doing a kind of 10-minute presentation covering the very basics of the American election. We'll be talking about the Electoral College, Battleground States, national level factors, all those things. So without further ado, let's begin then. Okay, so unless you've been living under a rock, the first thing we can cover about the US election, if you go to the next slide, is that it occurs once every 4 years. So this is a thing that usually happens in November. The two major parties in the US are the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans are also known as the GOP, or the Grand Old Party. The Republicans are represented by Donald Trump, the current incumbent president in the USA, while the Democrats are being represented by Joe Biden, who was vice president in the Obama administration from 2008 to 2016. So next slide, please. Yes, if we look at the current national polling as of 20th October, Biden holds about a 9-point lead nationally over Donald Trump. And some polling sites will report this differently. Some will say it's roughly a 10-point lead. Some people will say it's roughly a 9-point lead. But regardless, this is a fairly large, fairly substantial lead. What's notable about this election is just how stable it's been in the sense that compared to 2016, where Hillary Clinton and Trump, was going up and down and up and down. This has been a solid kind of 8-point lead for Biden, expanding into 9 points recently. And this has been remarkably kind of consistent going into the final few days of polling. If the election was held today, at this moment, Joe Biden would actually win the Electoral College with 279 votes without winning any of the toss-up states. So right now, Biden's 9-point lead places him in an extremely strong position to carry the Electoral College right now. If we can go to the next slide, please. And why does Biden hold this 9-point advantage? What makes his position really, really strong at the moment? We can roughly kind of break down his position into 3 kind of national level factors that influence the current state of polling, regardless of the states, individual battleground states that we're talking about. The first is the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic by the Trump administration. It's important to kind of note that the Trump administration had advance warning of COVID-19. It was rampaging across Asia for the early parts of the year. But suffice to say, the Trump administration has not handled COVID-19 well and has gotten a lot out of control in the US. What's happened as a result of this is that a lot of people have lost faith in the Trump administration's ability to govern kind of responsibly and effectively, particularly among over 65 people or seniors who are particularly at risk of COVID-19. One of the other national level factors influencing the polls at the moment is the Black Lives Matter protests. So the Black Lives Matter protests caused initially by the shooting of George Floyd kind of showed the Americans, the Republicans' record on race relations, which is, suffice to say, not very strong. What's happened as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests is that it's brought race relations as a top issue on the ballot, and Republicans have not done very well on this metric. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the state of the economy. Traditionally, Republican leaders have been seen as kind of better on the economy in a lot of ways. But despite Trump's kind of parroting or trumpeting of his record, the economy right now is not in a very good position. What's happening throughout the US is unemployment is still pretty high. The stock market has kind of recovered due to the Fed, but unemployment is high and people are not satisfied with the way the economy is run at the present moment. So saying all this, let's go to the next slide. We can kind of look at the current state of play. So this is kind of a map of every single state in the US and their electoral college vote. The larger the bubble, or the larger the kind of the circle, the more electoral college vote the individual state has. So the states that we want to be looking at in terms of the analysis that we'll be doing for this session are going to be the states that are closer to the center. So we're going to be looking at kind of states like Michigan, the bubble with 16 in it, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, and kind of North Carolina and Georgia. So these kind of 6 or 7 states are going to be the states that are crucial in this election. They're known as battleground states or swing states. And kind of we'll break down what's going on in kind of 2 separate areas that we can roughly group these swing states into. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. We can roughly group the 2020 battlegrounds into 2 separate areas, 2 separate geographical areas in the US. The first is something called the Rust Belt, and the second is something called the Sun Belt. So let's talk about the Rust Belt now, and let's pinpoint where the Rust Belt is. So the Rust Belt is in an area of the US known as the Midwest. For the Malaysians, the Midwest is not actually near California, it's actually kind of in the northeast of the US, so it's a bit of a misnomer. But yeah, this is where the Rust Belt is. Kind of, you can see the yellow highlighted areas in the map. The Rust Belt covers states from all the way from Wisconsin in kind of the northwest to Pennsylvania. So for the purposes of the 2020 election, the swing states in the Rust Belt area are Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Why is this area called the Rust Belt? Well, it used to be called the Steel Belt initially. This area used to be very well known for steel manufacturing in the US, automotive manufacturing, particularly in Detroit. But what happened is that manufacturing slowly shifted away from this area, first to the southern United States, and then into other parts of the world like Mexico, and then eventually to Japan, and finally to China. So this was an area that used to have a lot of manufacturing and used to have kind of a lot of activity, but it's kind of declined a lot recently, and this is why it's called the Rust Belt at present moment. The Rust Belt is significantly older than most of the US. It's also significantly more white than the rest of the US. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, but what was critical in 2016 was that this Rust Belt was a highly democratic area before, voting 1992 to 2012, all the way Democratic. But Trump managed to flip 3 states in the Rust Belt, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and ultimately resulted in his Electoral College victory in 2016. Trump needs to win at least one of those states in order to kind of stand a shot this election. And unfortunately for Trump, there are serious problems in the Rust Belt that he has to overcome at present moment. As we mentioned before, the Rust Belt is significantly older than the average population in the US, and the shambolic COVID-19 response by the Trump administration means that a lot of seniors have lost confidence in the Trump administration's ability to govern, which is kind of dampening numbers in this region. The Black Lives Matter protests actually started in this area as well, in Minnesota as well as in Wisconsin. And kind of Trump and the Republican record on race relations is not exactly the strongest right now. Finally, in 2016, Trump campaigned on bringing back jobs to this kind of jobs-deprived region. And he was like, okay, we're going to bring your jobs back from China. And unfortunately, those promises haven't quite been fulfilled. Foxconn, the Taiwanese manufacturer, was supposed to open a plant. It hasn't quite materialized just yet. And if it does open, it's going to be much smaller than initially anticipated. And the trade war, instead of kind of bringing jobs back, has actually kind of damaged a lot of things in the region. So there's a sense of, these promises in 2016 not being fulfilled. Trump needs to hold on here, and it's very, very difficult for him, but he will see that he has other problems in other areas as well. If we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the other battleground. This is not just a one-front war that Trump is fighting. This is a two-front war. He has to deal with problems in the Rust Belt, as well as deal with problems in what we call the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt is in the southern part of the US, comprising states all the way from California in the southwest to Florida in the southeast. Why is it called the Sun Belt? Because it's really sunny. A lot of these states, all from Arizona to kind of South Carolina, were solidly Republican for a very, very long time. So it's kind of the opposite of what we call of the Rust Belt, which was solidly Democratic. This used to be at least a solidly Republican area that no matter what would usually go Republican. But as we can see in the next slide, this is not the case in this election. What's happening right now is that a lot of the battleground states in the Sun Belt are under significant pressure from basically two reasons. The first is that the Sun Belt is actually a very dynamic, very young area. The population is significantly younger than the average US population. It's also very kind of multiracial, and it's also very urban. All of these things are very good predictors for how someone is going to vote Democratic. And these trends have been happening throughout the Sun Belt for a very long time and kind of manifesting in this election. In addition to kind of the demographic shifts and the demographics changing, the suburban vote is also looking very vulnerable right now. The suburban vote, at least back in the 80s and the 90s, used to be a very, very solid Republican vote. But as kind of the Republican Party has changed, as their cultural values have changed, the suburban vote has kind of deserted the Republicans because the values of suburban voters, which are increasingly aligning with urban voters, no longer align with the Republican Party. So what's happening is that this demographic shift and this loss of the suburban vote is leaving the red wall extremely vulnerable in places like Arizona, which is highly suburban, as well as even places like Texas and Georgia. So let's kind of summarize everything that's going on here. As we mentioned before, battleground and swing states are really important for the disproportionate amount of impact they have in the US election. And the two main kind of geographical areas that we'll be focusing on are the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt. In the Rust Belt, the BLM protests and the COVID-19 pandemic and the way Trump has handled it has resulted in kind of a loss of confidence. And in the Sun Belt, changing demographics and kind of the cultural realignment of suburban voters has led to a lot of trouble for the Republicans. So that's about it from me. Thank you very much for listening to this part of the presentation. I'll now pass the time back to Steve to pass it on again. Thank you.
I just want to explain a little bit about what Ernest talked about, the blue state, the red states, the red wall and all that. If you have a problem understanding that concept, just think of Malaysia, think of Penang state as a DAP stronghold. In order to flip DAP, it's not easy, it's going to be quite difficult. Just imagine another one, Kelantan has for many, many years, a strong bastion of the past, the Islamic party. Okay, then you think of Perak, it's probably a toss-up, probably a swing state. Certain years, it leans towards the Barisan side. Certain years, it leans towards the PH, Pakatan Harapan side. So in US situation is pretty much like that. Okay, I'm going to move on to Dr. Ang. okay, it's going to answer two questions, poll, and polls. In 2016, I mean, the pollsters almost lost their job, okay? They got it so wrong that, in fact, some actually came out to say, if this round they are wrong again, they probably have to close shop, seriously close shop, okay? So, Dr. Ang, Biden clearly is in the lead right now, okay, according to most of the polls. But could we see another surprise, okay, due to the presence of the so-called Trump silent voter? They are too shy or they are too scared to tell people their political leaning, fearing that they may get scolded, they may be, victimized or something like that. Okay, can we believe in the poll? That's the first question. The second question is, we probably need you, since you're an expert in this area, to probably go through some of the swing states, what we call the toss-up stage, okay, particularly the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, Arizona, Texas, Florida, and the so-called white collar and the blue collar Rust Belt. Okay, Dr. Ang, over to you.
Okay, good morning, Steve, and first and foremost, thank you for inviting me to talk to your viewers about the elections in this webinar. So let's first talk about the polls, right? So the national polls, as Ernest has said, shows that Biden has anywhere from a 9 to 10 point lead in the polling averages. The national polling is usually not a problem, right? So where a lot of the difficulty showed up in 2016 were the state polls, right? So state polls, even today, probably have some issues regarding their methodology. So, but first and foremost, right, I think the viewers need to understand what polls can or cannot tell them, right? So polls should always be viewed as a snapshot in time, or at least, when the polls were taken. And polls are indicative of the state of the race. They are not predictive, and they are certainly not dispositive. So and all polls have also a certain margin of error, right? In the US, right, sort of polling is sort of doubly difficult because first the pollsters have to get their sampling frame right. So they have to determine whether their sample accurately reflects the population that they're trying to study. So basically, is it reflective of the population? Second, because the United States, unlike most other civilized industrial countries, doesn't have automatic registration, it makes it very difficult to determine who is a likely voter, right? So different pollsters are going to have different methodologies regarding, who they think is going to be a likely voter. And again, if you pay attention to sort of the polls and the fine print, right, you will see polls looking at likely voters versus registered voters, right? So registered voters is much easier to determine, right? They just sample people who are registered voters, right? Trying to determine a likely voter is much more difficult. Okay, so back to this year's polls. We just simply do not know whether this year's polls have any error and which direction the polling error, if any, is going to be. So in 2016, right, sort of there was some error in the polls and it benefited Trump. But sort of right now we have no idea whether, right, there is going to be polling error and if it's actually going to benefit Trump.
So, Doc, is there something like a Biden silent voter?
Okay. So your okay. The second part of your question was about whether there are Trump silent voters, right? Okay.
Yeah.
It is, well, to me, it is highly unlikely that there are hidden Trump voters because, right, we have the highest quality polls are live polls, right? Polls where the pollsters actually call up voters either through their cell phones or through landlines. right? Sort of the lesser quality polls are polls that are conducted online. And most of the polls we see is that they match one another. So if you would assume that, right, sort of these Trump voters are sort of shy about, right, disclosing their preference for Trump, we don't see that in the online polls, right? It would be easier for them if such, right, sort of shy or hidden Trump voters exist, to be able to pick them out in an online poll where they are, much more anonymous. They don't have to interact with, somebody over the phone. They just, right, sort of click their answers.
Yeah. Let's talk about the swing states. What is the likelihood of the swing states sticking with Trump this round? Okay, we have got our Ohio, is a dead heat there. Okay, we have got Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and we have got Arizona that's potentially could be turning blue, and Florida. Could you give us a rundown on the state by state analysis, or a belt by belt analysis?
Sure. If we could advance the slide, we can start with sort of the macro picture, right? So basically, what Trump has to do. If we look at first, right, sort of the traditional red states that Ernest talked about, right, sort of Texas, Georgia, Iowa. These are traditional red states, right? He called them, I think, part of the red firewall. So the fact that these states are even competitive is a very bad sign for Trump, right? So prior to COVID, prior to the pandemic, I don't think even the most optimistic Biden campaign assessment would have been that, they would even be, close to putting these states in play. So he needs to win, right? Texas, Georgia, and Iowa, right? And he probably will, because as we'll see as when we look at in these states in more detail, these are relatively red states, right? In the more traditional battleground states, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, right? Sort of, they're going to have to move closer to Trump, and Trump is at least going to have to win, right? Florida and Ohio. It's going to be hard to see him win to get to 270 without these states, and he also has to win basically Arizona, right? So the other states listed there, Minnesota, Nevada, Colorado, those were blue states. They went for Hillary in 2016. The polls, again, do not indicate that Trump is anywhere close to flipping any of them. So again, right, sort of overall, how likely is all of this going to happen? Right, not very likely. So right, 538 gives it a 1 in 8 chance. Right, the economists are more pessimistic, right, just a 7% chance. But if we move to the next slide, we can talk more about the individual states. Right, so okay, ladies and gentlemen, do not freak out about all these numbers. It's actually quite we'll walk through some of the data. All right, so the first column is just, right, so that the states, and in parentheses are the number of electoral votes in them. The 2016 spread is about the margin of victory in 2016. So in Iowa, Trump plus 6 mean, right, Trump won Iowa by 6 points over Hillary Clinton. Where it starts to get interesting is the column marked Cook PVI. That is the Cook Political Reports Partisan Voting Index. So that, right, gives us an idea of how Republican or how Democratic a state is, right? So Iowa is R plus 3, right? So is Ohio. So, right, both Ohio and Iowa are Republican states. And what is interesting is right, if we look at the Rust Belt states, right, Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, although, right, they are sort of traditionally considered, right, states in the blue firewall, if you look at the Cook PVI, right, the Cook PVI is also based on the 2016 and 2012 elections, right? They have become very, very close states. So basically, they have not so much been, right, so the blue firewall states as they are purple states, right, swing states. And so, right, again, right, if we look at the polls right now, Biden has a much easier path to 270, right? Because all Biden has to do is to hold on to the states that Hillary Clinton won, right? And flip Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, right? And with their 46 electoral votes, it gets him to 273, right?
That's Florida.
He doesn't need Florida. So Biden has the simplest path to 270, right? So and if he flips, right, the Rust Belt on election day, anything else, Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, is just icing on the cake. It is just simply going to pad, right, his electoral margin, right? And so if we look at the last two columns, right, that's the tipping point probability, right? The tipping point probability is the probability that the state will cast the deciding 270th electoral vote, right? And sort of the consensus, right, 538 economists and other forecasters is that it is going to come down to Pennsylvania, right? And here, right, Biden is supposed to have some sort of home advantage, right? He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, right? Right. He still claims, right, that he is Joe from Scranton. And again, one of the differences, right, where we see with Biden versus Hillary is Biden is a much better candidate than Hillary. He is doing much better with white voters, especially white working class voters. Right. And this is going to be important in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, because again, right, the margin, right, we have to look at the margins, right? The Democrats, Hillary lost these three states by a combined 80,000 votes, right? That is very close, and it'll be quite easy or relatively easy for Biden to get the swing to retake those three states. And again, right, sort of assuming the polls are correct, right, Biden is leading in those three states right now.
Okay. Shall we move to the panel? Yep. Okay, thanks, Dr. Ang, for a rundown on the state-to-state analysis plus the poll. We know Donald Trump has got an uphill task. It's very, very difficult. Let's hear it from Mark. Okay, Mark, you're American. You have been here for many, many years. I guess you liked it here. But you still have got relatives and friends residing in US. Okay. What really intrigued me as a Malaysian is why US has become so polarized. You know, why that? I mean, somebody friend told me, you want to understand why US is so polarized, just go and watch Tiger King. You know, this Netflix series on Netflix series. Okay, just watch Tiger King. You understand why US is so polarized, the whites versus the rest of the world. Okay, give us a bit of background, okay, from your American perspective. You don't have to tell us your political leaning.
No problem. I mean, I think it's a matter of changing demographics over several decades, right? I mean, you have a traditional white European immigrant base, right, over 100 years or so, that has, largely populated the country. And then in the last, 20, 30 years, you have, an influx of immigrants from other parts of the world that, that have different cultures, they have different, maybe in some cases, slightly different values, And this is, seems often threatening, right, to the aging or perhaps the traditional white population that is being squeezed out in many cases, right? And so the divisiveness really comes with people like Trump, really, trying to stir that up, right? He talks about make America great again. He's really trying to harken back to days of days past, and this rings very, very strong with rural conservative people. Things like the Second Amendment, gun rights, religion, even pro-life. I mean, it's really hard to tell whether Donald Trump is pro-life or not, but I mean, certainly the Republican Party is pro-life, right? So that it just, he just does a fantastic job actually to stir emotions. And then reacting on the other side, of course, has been, the more liberal leaning population, right? And so, they've gotten a little, their hair up on the back of their neck, right, over the last couple of years because of what the more conservative or what the, what the sort of Trump's base has been doing. So I think the demographics in the U.S. have been changing, will continue to change. Immigration is basically a foundational part of the culture in America, right? And so as more immigrants come in, it will continue to change, and they will continue to populate urban areas and suburban areas. And eventually it's thought that they will, and the threat is they will squeeze out the sort of traditional, older generation Americans.
Mark, you still talk to your friends and relatives and family in US. Okay.
Right.
Has Trump's support base expanded?
Well, not the people I talk to, okay? I mean, I have some adult sons, 2 adult sons there, and I have family there, right? You go back to 2016, there was a big anti-Clinton sentiment by a lot of folks, right? Including some of my family, right? And so Trump was an unknown, and he got a bit of a protest vote, I think. But when I in conversations with my friends and family now, most have given up on Trump, most, not all. I have these disagreements with my mother all the time, who still says she's voting for Trump, and I don't want to talk about it. That's kind of her position. But the rest have seen through, who he really is in terms of his character. But it's interesting because my 2 older sons, who are like 28 and 31, they're not going to vote for Biden either. They're going to vote for libertarian. They're going to vote, somebody who thinks represents them or their position more than either party. So there is still, I think, a significant populace that is not really happy with either party. But I think that the dissatisfaction with Trump is stronger, right? So I think he's lost some support over the last 4 years.
Okay. Ernest, I think conversation regards to Trump's diehard support base may not necessarily be a Trump support base, but conservatives. You want to talk a little bit about that? That this particular conservative group will forever stick with the conservative doctrine, and regardless of who is on the ticket, they will vote Republican.
Yeah, okay, so I think when we consider the kind of Trump vote, a lot of the kind of stereotypes around the Trump voters is that, they're all the most vocal Trump supporters, the ones that are attending Trump rallies, the ones that are kind of waving, Make America Great Again flags. And there are a lot of Trump voters out there who are like that. But I think there's a significant amount of these Trump voters or Republican voters who aren't your typical kind of Trump diehard supporters. You think of kind of your former Republican suburban voter who maybe is your kind of small government, low tax, low regulation Republican, who's maybe kind of a centrist to center right socially. And those kinds of people, they may not necessarily like the way that Trump represents himself, but they may not necessarily like the kind of populism or even the kind of the antics in general, but they'll say, okay, compare it to the Democrats, compare it to what's going on the other side. I agree with more of the Republican program than the Democrat program. I think one of the most important things here is actually the Supreme Court. For the Republicans and for conservatives in general, the Supreme Court has been a really, really huge thing for maybe even the last kind of generation or so. And Trump in 2016, he was like, we're going to take the Supreme Court, we're going to appoint people to the Supreme Court. And for a lot of Republican voters in 2016, they were willing to kind of suck it up, and they were saying, okay, you know what, I don't like Trump, but I'm going to vote for the Republicans so that we can secure a majority on the Supreme Court. Just to add one more thing, it's almost counterintuitive now, but now that the Republicans have what seems to be a really good majority on the Supreme Court, with the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, which looks to be happening soon, they'll have kind of a 6-3 majority. There's actually an argument to be made that takes away one of the reasons to vote for the Republicans, because if you're voting for the Republicans to make sure conservatives have a majority on the Supreme Court, now that they have a majority on the Supreme Court, you don't need to vote for them anymore. So that's actually a bit counterintuitive to think about, but that's something I think that's really interesting to consider.
Yeah, that's an interesting angle. Okay, I think our guests who are dialing in today, I think some of you are our investor. Let's talk a little bit about the investment implication. Okay, 2 scenarios: Biden victory and Trump victory. Chow Wei, you are the expert in this area. Okay, if Biden were to win, the market is afraid that he will hike the corporate tax. Okay, what is that going to have? What kind of impact would that have on the capital market?
Hey, so what Biden has talked about is to raise corporate tax from 21% to 28%. So let's start off with the financial impact in general to the corporates in America. So from what we've calculated, a very rough assessment, on average, it will cause a one-off decline of Americans' corporates' earnings by about 8 to 9%. But it's very important to note that this is a one-off reduction rather than a multi-year reduction. So from an investment perspective, when it is a one-off reduction in earnings, typically market can be more forgiving and more willing to look through it, because you will have a one-off step down in earnings, but subsequently the businesses will continue to grow its profitability. So for the stock market, you may see a mini adjustment. Maybe it could fall by 3 to 5% to adjust for the one-off reduction in profitability. But on the other hand, you asked about corporate taxes, but there are also other policies and other things that Biden will bring that will be positive and offset the negative effect of higher corporate taxes. One will be the potentially less trade war risk. I'm not saying US will be best buddy with China, with Biden, but what I mean is Biden will be less bad compared to Trump. He is less erratic. And also Biden has openly said that he truly respects international laws and international organization. And very recently, World Trade Organization has ruled that Trump's tariff on China is illegal. So Biden is likely to listen to WTO. If it's illegal, maybe Biden will reduce some of the tariff or remove some of the so-called illegal tariff. So there's negative aspect, there's also positive aspect for Biden and market, which is why to a certain degree, especially in the past 2 weeks, you see that markets have been going up in the US market, US stock market, because they believe with Biden winning the president, there is a higher chance of a bigger fiscal stimulus in the US. And of course, that will be good for the economy, good for businesses, and good for the stock market. So there's...
The market is slowly warming up to a blue sweep, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What if Trump is elected? Okay. Status quo?
I will say to a large degree, things will be status quo. Yes, he is an erratic person. He will continue to be fairly unpredictable when it comes to dealing with China. If you look at the past 2 years, there will be months when Trump will say, "Oh, we have secured a deal with China. We are best friend with China. I like Xi Jinping." But then a month later, he'll be all hostile towards China. Oh no, there's no deal. I'm going to raise tariff even further. So that's very erratic and unpredictable. But the thing is that the stock market or the investment community, they tend to adjust and adapt. After 2 years of living with Trump's unpredictability, to a certain degree, the market is used to it and is better able to adjust to it. Meaning with Trump, yes, things won't be great with China, but there's no new incremental negative surprises. They know how Trump is.
Yeah. What if you get a hung situation? You get a Republican Senate, probably a Democrats Congress, okay, but a a Biden presidency, okay.
Okay. In terms of the market implication for Asian stocks, I think there will be limited impact. It's not a big deal. For example, even as of today, you have Trump being a president, you have Republican controlling the Senate, but you have Democratic Party controlling the House of Representatives. It is divided. So after 2020, if it's divided again, it won't affect the Asian stock markets a lot. But for the US side, one risk that you will see from this division is that there will be further delay of the fiscal stimulus 4.0. What that is basically government stimulus package to people who are unemployed, to small businesses that are struggling in the current pandemic. And for many analysts, this fiscal stimulus 4.0 is needed to keep them afloat so that they can continue spending, or small businesses can continue to run their businesses and pay their workers. They don't have to lay off so many people. If this is further delayed, we may see the US economy to soften, say in December, January, and February. So what I'm trying to say is that we are likely to see further delay in fiscal stimulus talk because you have a division, so they will be fighting against each other again. But the thinking is, what will happen if this takes place is that the economy will soften so much, the stock markets and other investment markets will fall, and typically how the US politicians behave is that when things get bad enough, they typically come to an agreement to try to arrest the economic weakness and financial markets weakness. So you may see a period of 3 to 4 months of weakness, but subsequently when there's enough pain, they will get their act together and likely to approve or agree with a fiscal stimulus plan.
Regards to sectoral, sectors going to benefit from Biden's presidency versus Trump's presidency. Do you have any take on that? I know Biden, definitely your solar farm, anything to do with environmental, or basically environmental industry is going to do well. The infra guys.
Infrastructure guys, yes.
Yeah.
On the other hand, sectors that will struggle, the healthcare sector will be among those that will struggle a lot because there is an intention to further reduce the pricing of drugs. So big pharmaceutical companies will suffer. Second is I won't use the word suffer or struggle. It is the big technology companies, the likes of Facebook, Amazon, and Google. In fact, they are currently being investigated for antitrust by antitrust agencies for using their dominance to knock out smaller competitors. So you will hear a lot of noises on that with Joe Biden. In fact, to a certain degree, also if it's Donald Trump. But it's important to note that on the surface in the media, you will hear a lot of noises of these big companies being investigated. But the real business implication, in our view, is likely to be less bad. Why I'm saying that is because if we look at past history of antitrust investigation, it will take at least 2 to 3 years. That's one. And secondly, when we look at the details of what the antitrust investigations have brought up, it's not very, very strong arguments. There's a fair chance that 2 years or 3 years later, they may just probably put on a very a rather mild financial penalty, like a few billion of penalty, and nothing much is done. It's very hard to argue that they should be broken up, these companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook. But I'm not a legal expert. I'm not saying that I'm 100% sure, but from what I understand so far, it's not easy to prosecute them and break them apart. So our view is that we are still invested in these companies. And when we look at in history, for example, during Microsoft's investigation, in the end, Microsoft business continued to do well, and there's no breakup. There's just a modest fine. That's it.
Yeah. Is it fair to assume, whether it's under Biden's presidency or Trump, that the interest rate, the monetary policy, will continue to be very, very easy going into 2021? So regard to investors in bonds, in fixed income, okay, that will be a support for the prices going to 2021. Is it fair to make that assumption?
I have a different opinion in that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The first part about interest rate being kept at a low level, that is true. I think that will happen probably even beyond 2021. The reason is because if you look at the economic damage that the pandemic has caused, it's really severe and deep. The number of unemployment in US is still very, very high. A lot of small businesses have struggled so much, and it will really take time for them to recover. But if you look into 2021, although there's talk of vaccine and all, it will take months or quarters for them to build up enough vaccine supply, even if one succeeds. And it will also take time to vaccinate the majority of the population, meaning it will take 1 to 2 years before we can move on from the pandemic, meaning we can go travel, go to the malls without wearing a mask. It will take time, meaning businesses will also take time to recover. What that means is that unemployment situation will not fully recover back to pre-pandemic level, not in 2021, not in 2022. It will improve, but not back to pre-pandemic level. And the global central banks, including Fed, have shared that they intend to keep interest rate at a very low level until we return closer back to pre-pandemic level of economic activity. But then the second part of the question is why I'm a little bit more hesitant to say that bond market will continue to be okay, or bond yield will go lower. I'm reluctant to say that. It's because yes, the interest rate will be kept low, but on the other hand, you have bond yield, which is driven by market participants, not by central banks.
Yep.
So how market participants may behave is that they will think, okay, if Biden wins, there will be a big fiscal stimulus. If Trump wins, Trump also wants to have cut taxes further and also do some form of stimulus, meaning economic activity will gradually recover. And bond yield, which has already fallen to a very, very low level during the first leg of the pandemic, during March, April, when the market crashed, bond yield has fallen so much already. And when the bond investors sense that, okay, the economy is gradually recovering, even though not back to pre-pandemic level, but directionally is gradually recovering, and you have so much fiscal stimulus being pumped into the market, interest rate being kept at a low level, people will start to think that, okay, inflation, which is very low, will gradually pick up. So if they believe that inflation will gradually pick up over the next 3 to 5 years, bond yield, because these are investors, they tend to price ahead. They tend to predict what will happen. So they will start to be more cautious with their investment in bond, in how they see bond yield. So they will, if they believe economy will gradually recover, inflation rate will gradually strengthen, they will also expect bond yield to gradually increase. So they will also be less excited in buying more and more government bond. So bond yield may actually increase. So in that environment, I won't say it's all bad for the bond market, but it can be a bit of a challenge to bond yield.
Okay, thanks, Chawi. Okay, it's exactly 55 minutes into our forum. I'd like to open the floor to all the panelists, and questions are streaming in. Some of them we have actually answered. Let me take up this question from Alex Tan. Do you think the ongoing corruption case, okay, fact check, corruption is a bit misleading, against Hunter Biden, Biden's son, may impact the results? Okay, I've done a bit of reading from here. Maybe Dr. Ang, you want to talk a little bit about this? Do you think it's a corruption case? I think it's quite misleading, right?
Yeah, I don't. I would put sort of corruption in right sort of quotation marks or inverted commas. So again, right, sort of, I think all sort of the investigations and evidence suggest that it is not the case.
Yeah.
And we are at the point where, I just checked this morning with the U.S. Elections Project. Michael McDonald at the University of Florida is the leading expert on turnout in the U.S. 53 million Americans have already voted.
Mm-hmm.
So we are on pace to have a majority of Americans vote prior to election day. So election day is this time around is a bit of a misnomer. So with that in mind, and also if you look not just at the polls, but if you look at the crosstabs of the polls, is that this is going to be a party ID election, meaning that Democrats are homogeneously basically for Biden and Republicans are going to be for Trump. So basically, there are very few undecided voters. And right, sort of unlike the case of Hillary's emails in 2016, this is probably not going to move the needle very much one way or the other.
Yeah. Mark, you agree?
Yeah, I would. As a matter of fact, even if something substantial arises from Biden's son's activities, if the Democrats sweep the election, it's not going to amount to much. There won't be support in Congress to go after Biden or to make it. There'll be a lot of pressure to sweep it away.
Yeah, in fact, I've been monitoring the odd makers odds. Since this has surfaced, it hasn't moved the needle at all. In fact, the poll hasn't moved at all. Okay, reacting to Hunter Biden's case. Okay. Okay, Ohio. This question from Danny. Ohio has voted for the victor in every presidential election since 1964. Trump currently leads poll there. Does this mean that Trump might win? I think, Doc, this is probably your area. Okay. You can win Ohio and lose Florida and Arizona. You still lose the election. You think Ohio is a very, very good barometer in this case?
Ohio is a bellwether. So the last president to win the election without winning Ohio was actually FDR, right? But as I pointed out, if you look at the electoral map, Biden can win without Ohio. Trump cannot.
Yep. Good point. Okay. Early voting has begun. You just mentioned. This is the question from Yi Hao. Are the results telling us anything? I mean, of course, the results right now, if you look at the registration, is a little bit pro-Democrats. But are we too early to conclude that the Democrat has got an advantage here? Maybe Doc?
Yeah, hi. It is definitely too early to tell anything because, right, just looking at party registration can be misleading, right? So a lot of people have never changed their party registration. So we can have, registered Democrats who have been voting Republican for the last 20 years and vice versa. So it definitely is too early to tell.
Okay. Okay, I think this is on everybody's mind. Okay. Question from Chu. What will happen if Trump refuses to concede defeat and refuses a peaceful transition of power if he loses? Ernest, do you have something to say about this?
Okay, so whether Trump refuses to step down and whether that's possible will largely depend on, I think, the margin of victory in this election. So if we get kind of a 9 to 10 point lead, it's a Democratic landslide, it's undeniable that the Democrats win, it is very, very difficult for Trump to hold on to power, even if he says he doesn't want to step down, because the evidence is very clear. It's a 9, 10 point lead, all states are reporting, whatever. It's very hard for Trump to contest it. Where we start getting into a bit of uncertain territory is if the race moves to about 2 to 3 points. So this is a very unlikely scenario, but if we start moving to the point where a lot of states are getting toss-ups and we start getting recounts and mail-in ballots and we have to check everything and we start going into that sort of territory, then we get into a lot of uncertainty. If we get to that point, and Trump says he's not conceding defeat, we could be in for like a month or 2 months of just contested results that would make 2000 Bush versus Gore look like child's play in comparison. So as of right now, the scenario where Trump chooses not to step down and doesn't concede defeat is unlikely because of Biden's very, very strong lead at present moment. If it happens, it's probably going to be pretty chaotic for the next 1 or 2 months. But again, highly unlikely to happen right now unless something quite significant changes.
Okay. Speaking of chaos, Mark, you talk to your friends, you talk to your family members there. Your QAnon, your Proud Boys, these guys are all arming. Okay, even the black guys are arming. Okay, gun sales has picked up as charted records. What do you hear from your friends and family there? Are they buying guns? Are they preparing for a civil war, for goodness sake? Or,
at least,
I mean, the military has said categorically that they are not going to get involved.
Well, I think these are the fringe elements of society, right? But they can make a lot of noise, right? So, I mean, I certainly don't have anybody that I know of, right, that would be in that category. But I think this actually is, to me, is one of the short-term concerns, is even if it's not likely that Trump could succeed in saying that he's not stepping down or he's protesting, he could stir enough people to make enough trouble, right? That it just raises alarm bells in many places across the country. I mean, there are trigger happy people on both sides, right? That would be waiting for this kind of event, right? Let's just hope it doesn't happen. Let's hope that, as Ernest said, right, that the results are clear, right? I also don't think that, you've heard many comments. I don't think that the Republican Party also would be that supportive of, Trump holding out, right? Unless there was really some issues that were very clear, right, that emerged, which are not likely to happen. I mean, even you look at the hanging Chad issue, right, in Florida, 20 years ago. I just can't I can't see it. But I could see pockets of violence happening in the Trump loss, regardless of whether he tries to hold out.
Okay. Since we're on this issue, I think Dr. Ang, there is a question from Ronnie for you. If Trump refuses to hand over power, assuming he loses, what can Biden do to assume basically the step into the presidential role come on January 20th? There's going to be a legal route to it. Okay. Is the marshal, is the military, or are the police going to be backing him if the result is overwhelmingly pro-Biden? Yeah.
Okay, so if his term ends at 12 noon on January 20th, 2021, full stop, right?
Yeah.
So if in this very, very unlikely scenario that there is a disputed election and we still do not know for sure, constitutionally, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, assuming the Democrats win the House again and she is reelected as Speaker of the House, will become acting president.
Yeah. Okay. Discussion is getting a little bit tense with all these refusing to concede power and all that. Let's move a little bit away from there. A question from Xiang for, I guess, Chiao Wei. Will there be a buy on dip opportunity for good companies near election? Basically talking about probably a sharp correction that allows people like us to buy cheap, You think it's going to be a drop? Looking at your crystal ball.
I don't think it's likely, frankly. The first reason is because increasingly more people are expecting Biden to win and a clean sweep. And people are already thinking that, then it means there will be a bigger fiscal stimulus. So in fact, the market has rallied in the past 1 to 2 weeks. I'm referring to the US stock market. Yeah. Unless there is a very sudden or sharp reversal in the polling data, or something very negative happens and people believe that, hey, it's more likely to be a contested election. Mm-hmm. For example, the odds of Biden and Trump narrows. There's no longer a 9 to 10 points lead by Biden. Then people will start to worry more about a contested election. Yep. In that environment, yes, you may have a pullback in the stock market. If that happens, I will say, yes, it is a great opportunity to buy stocks. Assuming it falls low enough. It may fall, but it may not fall low enough to attract you. The reason I say that is, if there's a contested election, you may have 1 or 2 months of extreme chaos, people going riots on the street, people protesting. You talk about people arming themselves. But if you look at the history of riots in America, most of the time the stock market eventually recovered. In fact, the market weakness doesn't even hold for a very long time period. The US stock markets tend to be able to look past short-term chaos, short-term riots quite well. And because most of us know that there are laws and constitutions out there to resolve a contested election, so people in the investors' mind, those hedge fund managers, portfolio managers, they will always think that, okay, there's chaos now, but I know there's constitution to resolve a contested election eventually. So these investors will take the opportunity and buy any dips. But because so many people think that way, you may not even see a big pullback.
Yeah. Just to echo what you say, basically financial markets hates uncertainty. The more uncertain regards to the outcome of the election, the more uncertain the market performance. Okay.
Steve, sorry,
yep.
Steve, Can I follow on something that Jia Wei said in terms of,
Yep.
of certainty? Because constitutionally there are sort of dates that we all have to keep in mind, right? So December 8th, under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, right, has what we call a safe harbor provision. So if states present their slate of electors to Congress by December the 8th, Congress is obligated, legally obligated, to accept those slate of electors, right? December 14th is when the electors formally meet in the state capitals to formally vote. And then January 6th is when the new 117th Congress will convene in joint session to actually count the electoral votes again, right? So traditionally, the counting of the votes on January 6th is ceremonial and pro forma, and again, right, sort of hopefully this is the case. So everything should be resolved latest by January 6th.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Doc. There's a question in regards to China-US relationship from Mabel. How will Biden approach US-China relationship? What has he promised so far? And there is also a question in regards to this. Can we childishly, from Chi, can we childishly say if Biden wins, China will roar louder and rise faster? Okay, I think, Jia Wei, we spoke about the Biden's camp's stance in regards to dealing with China. You want to comment about that? Is it going to improve the U.S.-China relationship, or is it going to get worse, or is it going to be status quo?
Before we answer directly to the question, it's important to note that because there are surveys done to measure the sentiment of American voters, people who vote for both Democratic and Republican parties. Today, there's a majority of them who are untrusting of China, whether you are a Democrat supporters or you are a Republican supporters. So what that tells you is that majority of people in America, they don't trust China that much. So it means whether it's Biden or whether it's Trump, we are unlikely to go back to the time when US and China are good friends or are neutral parties. The hostility between the two countries are likely to continue. In the near term, as we shared about trade war, you may have a short-term or temporary relief, but the competition or hostility between the two nations are likely to continue in many years to come, probably in other forms. Yes, maybe not that much trade war, but there can be other forms of competition or conflict. For example, technology war, they refuse to export technology products to companies like Huawei and a few others, Chinese companies in China, to slow down their progress in technology. So the animosity should continue, but maybe not as erratic as Donald Trump.
Yep.
And another important thing to note is that unlike Donald Trump, who loves fighting others alone, Biden is different. Biden may be more willing to cooperate with other Western democratic nations like Canada, Australia, UK, and Germany. So in the long term, you may see US forming an alliance with all these Western democratic nations to collectively push back against China.
To curtail the Chinese. Yeah, Americans are hostile to the mainland Chinese, but they just love their TikTok, right?
The younger ones.
Yeah. Okay. I think this question is probably for Mark. If Biden is elected, how would that affect Trump's hardcore base? What are they going to do? Okay, say if they try to do some sort of civil war, try to take this onto the street, get somebody killed, and after a while, they'll go back into hiding, like what they have done over all these years.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, I think they're going to be small pockets, basically. I mean, I just cannot imagine, an uprising, so to speak, right? That is across the country. And I mean, you know, and no matter who's in charge, right, whether it be Biden or Trump, I mean, there are police, National Guard. I mean, you know, there are ways to keep order, right? But I think, again, I think if Trump does lose, I think you will see some protests. You will see that some protests could become violent. But I just can't see it escalating to you know, to some nationwide civil war. I think that is extremely unlikely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is
so if I
weird.
may add on to that, actually.
Yeah.
I just want to kind of note the kind of Republican Party in general is actually to some extent throwing Trump under the bus right now. So if we look at the behavior of some of the Senate Republicans, I think Ben Sasse, the senator from Nebraska, he kind of threw Trump under the bus when he was talking to his constituents. And we're seeing even people like Martha McSally in Arizona trying to distance themselves from Trump as much as he can. Mitch McConnell, you know, has made it very clear, you know, he wants to distance himself from Trump as much as possible. And it's very hard to see the entire Republican Party, you know, throw their backs into, you know, trying to defend the president who's lost. So I think like the Republican Party has kind of almost accepted, you know, Trump is going to lose, and they're not going to try to fight this tooth and nail.
Yep.
I think that's a good point, Ernest. I mean, there are plenty of Republicans who probably become anti-Trump, you know, after he loses, right? But they don't dare take that position now, right?
In fact, some are actually positioning themselves for presidential ticket for 2024. Yeah, Ted Cruz and a few guys are actually trying to position themselves to be the next in line, you know, after Biden's presidency, I guess. Yeah. Okay, I've got a weird questions, kind of weird. I guess it depends on who you ask, from Jackie. What is the American dream in 2020? I guess it depends on who you ask, right? I mean, what is the American dream? For the Trump supporter, they will definitely want Trump to be the president forever. For the Biden camp, they probably want to have a flip of the government so that there is a return to normalcy, return to decency and all that. Yeah, I don't know how to answer this question. You guys got any ideas? What is your American dream? If you answer the question, you're gonna divulge your political leaning. We're trying to be as non-partisan as possible. Yeah. Okay. Okay, there are about 2-3 questions. It's 11:20 right now. We'll be taking a poll. Let me just answer a couple of more questions before we move.
Yeah, Steve.
Yeah. Hi.
Can we talk about the first poll that you conducted?
Yeah.
That is actually fascinating. That is fascinating because I wanted to bring it up, right? Because the poll basically mirrors Trump's approval ratings, and Trump, the president's approval rating is basically the single best predictor of what his vote share is going to be. So the fact that, you know, the viewers said that, you know, 45% thought that he was going to win is probably about
that.
where his vote share is going to be. So if you look at the polling averages, Real Clear Politics, 538 and the rest, right? So the 45 is probably a very generous sort of top end of where we can expect Trump's share of the vote to be. It's going to be, I think right now it's about 42-43%, but the final Gallup poll for the president's approval rating is going to be very interesting.
Yep. Okay.
I thought I'd just point that out.
Yep. Thanks, Doc. Okay. From Ronnie, do you believe that electoral college will be altered, abolished, or changed, or got rid of completely anytime in the near future? That is probably, you're assuming, Rodney, you're assuming a Biden victory. Okay. Anybody? Maybe Doc. I think that's probably your area.
How in
Get rid of electoral college as a system?
It would require a constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
So, and given, as Mark has pointed out, how polarized the country is, right? The chances of getting a constitutional amendment to abolish the electoral college is about zero, because you're going to need 2/3 vote in both houses, and 3/4 of the state legislatures to vote. And all the small states, because again, right,
Yeah.
one of the problems with the Electoral College is it disproportionately empowers the small states. As Ernest has pointed out, if we look at the Electoral College, right, each state has electoral votes equivalent to its representation in Congress. So the number of members of Congress plus the senators. So if we look at California, for example, California has 53 members of Congress and 2 senators. So the additional 2 votes is minimal for California. But if you look at a state like Montana, Montana is so small, its population is so small that it has only 1 at-large member of Congress, right? But when you add the 2 additional electoral votes, it basically triples the voting power of a small state like Montana. So small states are not going to vote away, right, their electoral power. But there is something that is in the works. There is the National Vote Compact, right? So the states, there is a movement going on where states are going to pledge their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. So that is one way of circumventing the Electoral College without having, right, to go through the constitutional amendment route, abolish the Electoral College.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. We are moving to the last part of this forum. We're going to take a poll right now. With all this discussion, with all this information, opinion from the experts and novice alike, we're going to take a poll as to who do you think is likely to win. Trump prevails, Biden takes over, or it's going to be a dispute in election results, and the US Supreme Court this round, together with Amy Coney Barrett as the one of the Supreme Court judges, is going to be presiding over the verdict of the US election. Okay, you have. Yeah, let's take about a minute or half a minute to answer this. This one. Okay. Wow, look at that. Okay, Biden to take over 63%, Trump to prevail 14%, US Supreme Court intervenes 24%, so it is a overwhelming Biden, pro-Biden results, even after you have heard argument from both sides of the aisle. Okay, and well, before we end, I'd like to just probably call up the panelists to have the last word. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody, Dr. Ang, Mark, Chow Wei, and Ernest for contributing to this forum. Doc, you look at the results. Are you surprised? 63% think Biden is going to win, and 24% think it's going to be a contested results. Do you have
Again,
anything last word?
That is actually about what, if you look at real clear politics and the betting markets, that is about
Right,
so it's about 63 to 66%. The betting markets are showing a Biden win. So very good for the audience.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Ang. Mark?
No, I think I mean, the momentum, it seems clear. Everybody's just a bit skittish from 2016, right? So everybody's a bit cautious because they may still not understand what actually happened in 2016, and will it happen again, right? Or does Trump have some magical powers, right, that he can pull something out?
November surprise, perhaps.
Yeah.
November 1st surprise. Okay, thanks, Mark. Chow Wei, as a fund manager, did you like what you saw just now, the results?
The funny thing is, I thought, you know how initially there were 55% of people think that Biden will win, and after our presentation or discussion, more people swings to think Biden will win. I'm afraid that what we thought has influenced your decision rather than a fair observation. Now after our discussion, it seems like we have influenced how they view it.
Okay.
So maybe I'll just put one final thoughts about the investment. I just want to share that while politics, US election is very, very important things into the world, but for investment, it's not all about politics. There are things like how the economy is doing, how the pandemic is evolving, and how well businesses position themselves. So politics is one of the many things. So you don't have to make very extreme bets on US election in terms of how you invest.
Yeah. Okay. Any reflection from you, Ernest?
So I think you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted, Ernest. No, still no sound. Yep.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened in 2016 was basically the polls were about 3 to 4 points in favor of Hillary Clinton, which is within a normal size polling era of a Trump Electoral College victory, 2 to 3 points, right? But people didn't want to believe the race was close. Everyone was like, how on earth could Trump possibly win? And even though it was only a normal size polling era away from Trump winning, people didn't expect that Trump could win at all. So they kind of took that risk out of their minds, even though it was a very real risk that could happen. In 2020, it's kind of the opposite. All the polls are showing Biden with a strong 9 to 10 point lead that's been extremely stable throughout these last few months. But because everyone's been burned by 2016, they don't want to believe that that Biden has this. It's kind of the opposite end of 2016, but everything currently points towards Biden taking this in 2020, regardless of kind of people's fears of what happened in 2016.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ernest. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our online forum today, The Trend, US Election 2020. We hope today's session provide everyone with some new perspective and how investors can also position their portfolio for this risk event. I would like to thank the panelists again for sharing their thoughts and contributing to this forum. To all the participants, there was a special lucky draw for early sign-ups. We'll be in touch with you to arrange the delivery of the prizes. We also appreciate if you could complete a survey that's going to pop up when you exit Zoom. That will help us to improve our future events, and also for you to give us feedback as to what sort of topics you want us to cover in the future. Thank you, everybody, again, and take care and stay safe. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How was it?
It was good. It was good.
Okay, cool.
Good.